Hello, I'm Zoe Brazo, and today I'll be talking to you about Cyprian of Carthage's ecclesiastical power and church unity. So my project begins in the time period of the Decian persecution. This is 250 AD. During this time, Emperor Decius of the Roman Empire declared that all citizens would have to proclaim their faith to the Roman gods and to make a sacrifice. This didn't particularly target Christians, but because they were monotheists, it was declared a persecution in the Christian community. But this ended up ending in 251, less than a year later, because Decius died in a battle against the Goths. During this time, there was a figure named Cyprian, who was the bishop in Carthage, which is a city in North Africa. And he was bishop from 248 AD to 258 AD. So his reign not only lasted during the Decian persecution, but also the later Valerian persecution. So during the Decian persecution, he went into hiding and wrote letters to the clergymen, giving them instructions on how to behave and what decisions he felt that they should make. During this time period, and also immediately after the Decian persecution, he became known for speaking out against lapsism. So the lapsists were Christians who declared their faith or made a sacrifice during the persecution, which of course you weren't supposed to do. You were just supposed to follow the one true Christian God. You could also be considered a lapsist even if you didn't declare your faith or make a sacrifice, you purchased or bribed your way into getting a certificate that declared you had done so, which was, of course, very frowned upon for higher up in the church like this. So during the Decian persecution, while he was in hiding, many clergymen started taking on the role of the bishop while he was away from Carthage. And while Cyprian is known for going against lapsism, I hear argue that he cared more about the usurpation of his power during his time in hiding and the lack of unity in the church, particularly unity under his ultimate leadership. And so I really focus on all the ways that Cyprian is trying to assert his power over the lower clergy, as well as some other figures who also try to usurp his power. So this is the basic layout of my thesis: his time in hiding during the Decian persecution, his return to Carthage, and his later career during the Valerian persecution are the three main sections. So during his time in hiding, as I mentioned, some lower clergymen were taking on his role in making decisions regarding the lapsed. And he was writing letters trying to assert his power, keep his presence known among them, and let them know that he was still the bishop and they had no forgiving power. They couldn't forgive sins. Only the bishop could, which may surprise modern Christians since that's no longer the case in most sects of Christianity, to my knowledge, but only the bishop at this point was allowed to forgive sins. And so he also got far more upset with clergymen who lapsed than others who lapsed because they had taken a vow to the church and were supposed to be like this role model. He wrote against clergymen even communicating with the lapsed if it had been too soon. He felt that the lapsed people would need to take time to prove their worthiness before they could be forgiven. So they needed time of prayer and fasting and whatnot before they could be forgiven. And particularly, you needed to wait until the church as a whole had been forgiven, which would be signified actually by Cyprian's return. Because the persecution was a symbol of God punishing the Christians. And so if the persecution ended and therefore Cyprian was able to return, it would mean that God was no longer upset with the Christians. And also, Cyprian spoke about the bishop having a divine power, because Jesus chose the first bishop, being Peter, and Peter chose the next bishops, and they chose the next bishops, so on and so forth, making Cyprian essentially chosen by Jesus himself and a liaison for God on earth. So Cyprian's return to Carthage, he was able to more directly address lapsism because, again, his return meant that lapsism could be addressed. They could start being forgiven, and they could start being forgiven by Cyprian himself. However, his power was still his own concern. It still had to be Cyprian himself forgiving them. During this time, some rival factions of Christianity started to pop up over the issue of lapsism. There were the laxists, who were lenient towards the lapsed, the rigorists, who were strict, and then Cyprian was a moderate. So he took everything on a case-by-case basis. He would look at the individual and see whether or not they were repentant, or if they had a good excuse, like being forced or being too young to know any better. And so at this time, he not only had to convince the lower bishops to listen to him because he is the bishop and he is higher on the church hierarchy, but also to listen to him specifically, because there were bishops who were part of these other factions that he deemed schismatic and heretical. So Cyprian's later career during the Valerian persecution, this was a more religious persecution. It was more explicitly anti-Christian, and so he was exiled. He he didn't choose to leave. He was forced to, and he continued, like he did in the first persecution, to defend the divinity of the bishop and to write letters giving instructions. Something interesting is that he actually said that God visited him and told him about his time in exile and told him that he would be martyred, which he was indeed later martyred. So he also believed that his last words would be the Holy Spirit speaking through him, and he believed this only happened when a bishop specifically was martyred. Nobody lower on the church hierarchy had this extra bit of divinity that allowed the Holy Spirit to speak through them. And also during this time, you sort of see through the dynamics in the church that Cyprian was actually successful in his earlier work to assert his power over lower clergymen and the church as a whole. So I'll briefly review the literature. The main thing that I used for primary sources were Cyprian's own epistles and treatises, so in modern terms, letters and sermons. So he wrote a lot about lapsism and unity and gave a treatise on each of those topics. And in each of these, I do sort of see Cyprian asserting his own power. Some books and other pieces of literature that I used, Cyprian the Bishop, just an overview of his life and some deeper analysis. Cyprian in Roman Carthage has a more pagan and secular view on Cyprian. Early Christianity in North Africa talks about the African hierarchy, which of course Cyprian saw himself at the top. And then I'll move on to Valerian persecution. This was harder to research because there's less out there on it, but nonetheless, I did find some things, and these are them. So I'd recommend these if you'd like to read them. So here are my sources. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something.